The summer I helped my friend's mom was supposed to be ordinary, a few chores, shared laughs, nothing more. But the way she looked at me that afternoon, smiled, and said, "You're sweating already?" I haven't even started, that's when everything quietly changed. The first day of summer break always carried a kind of lazy promise, the air slower, the light softer, the hours stretching like warm honey. I hadn't planned on spending that morning at Ethan's place. I just dropped by to return his headphones, expecting him to be home. Instead, his mother opened the door. "Mrs. Lawson," I said, caught off guard. She blinked in surprise, then smiled, that calm, practiced smile I remembered from years ago when she'd pick us up from soccer practice. "You've changed," she said warmly, leaning against the doorframe. "You look older." Her voice had that effortless confidence that made everything she said sound deliberate. I mumbled something about being home for the summer, and she stepped aside, motioning me in. The house hadn't changed, the same framed photos, the faint scent of vanilla and lemon polish, the rhythmic hum of a ceiling fan struggling against the heat. "Ethan's out," she said, pouring iced tea into 2 tall glasses. "But you're welcome to wait." I nodded, though my pulse had already picked up. The sunlight streaming through the window made everything look softer, the gold in her hair, the curve of her smile, the way her blouse clung slightly at her shoulder where the fabric caught the breeze. We talked about nothing, her garden, my college, how fast time moved. She laughed easily, eyes bright with something that felt both familiar and new. When she asked for help with the patio umbrella, I followed her outside. The afternoon heat pressed down like a second skin. I wrestled with the latch, the metal hot under my palms, sweat already forming on my neck. She watched for a moment before teasing, "You're sweating already?" "I haven't even started." Her laughter rang light but lingered, playful, amused, and just a little personal. My grin faltered into something shy, uncertain. I didn't know if it was the heat or the sound of her voice, but I suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. "Here," she said, stepping closer. Her hand brushed mine as she adjusted the umbrella latch with easy strength. "You were forcing it." That touch, brief, accidental, left a tingling warmth that lasted longer than it should have. She handed me a glass of iced tea, condensation dripping onto her fingers. "Still the same," she said softly, "always trying too hard." I laughed awkwardly, and she smiled again, but this time, slower. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, something that made the space between us feel charged. The umbrella finally clicked into place. She looked up at the canopy, satisfied. "Perfect," she murmured, and for a second, we just stood there under the shade together, the air thick with sun and silence. Inside, the clock ticked faintly, marking a moment neither of us fully acknowledged. I told myself it was just the heat, just the awkwardness of seeing her again. But that small moment, her laughter, her nearness, the way her voice wrapped around my name, stayed with me long after I left. And I think, deep down, she knew it would. The next morning, Ethan texted to say he'd be gone most of the day, asking if I could drop by later to help his mom move some boxes. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to, but because part of me already knew I'd been thinking about her more than I should have. When I arrived, Mrs. Lawson was standing in the open garage, wearing a light denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up and her hair tied loosely at the back. A few wisps had escaped, brushing against her neck. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. "You came," she said. "Good. I was about to start without you." I grinned, trying to sound casual. "Wouldn't want you lifting all this alone." She laughed softly. "You say that now, but these boxes aren't as light as they look." The work began easy enough, sorting, lifting, wiping off dust. But the heat crept in quickly, and the air filled with the smell of cardboard, sunscreen, and her faint perfume, jasmine and something warm, familiar. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing at her. The way she moved, deliberate, calm, in control, had a quiet grace that made it hard to focus on anything else. At one point, I tried to lift a heavy box on my own, determined to impress her. My hand slipped, and the edge wobbled dangerously. She stepped forward fast, steadying it with both hands. "Careful," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Her fingers brushed my arm, light, but enough to make my pulse trip. She must have noticed the change in my breathing because she tilted her head and smiled. "You look nervous," she said, her tone teasing but kind. "Relax. It's just work." "Right," I said quickly, but my voice cracked, betraying me. She chuckled, a low, melodic sound that filled the small space between us. "You've always been too serious," she added, turning back to the shelves. "You think too much for your own good." I wanted to respond, but her words felt too accurate to challenge. So I kept quiet, lifting, sorting, letting the rhythm of our movements replace the silence. When we finally stopped, she poured lemonade into 2 glasses and joined me on the porch steps. The air had cooled slightly, the sky deepening to amber. She handed me a glass, our fingers brushing again. This time, neither of us pulled away too fast. "Funny," she said, gazing out at the garden, "how things change without you realizing. The house feels quieter these days." I looked at her, really looked. The calm in her voice couldn't hide the sadness underneath. "You still make it feel alive," I said before I could stop myself. She turned to me, surprised, and for a heartbeat, she didn't look away. The porch lights flickered on, catching the glint in her eyes, something warm, searching. Then she smiled, small, knowing, but softer than before. "You always did say the right things at the wrong time," she murmured. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but in a strangely peaceful way, like both of us knew something was beginning to unfold, slowly, quietly, just beneath the surface. The house was quieter that evening. The air felt cooler after a brief summer breeze had rolled through, carrying the scent of rain that never quite arrived. Ethan had gone out for dinner with friends, leaving me behind with a casual, "Mom's got leftovers if you're hungry." When I walked into the kitchen, Mrs. Lawson was there, barefoot, her hair slightly undone, humming faintly as she reheated food. The light from the stove haloed her figure in a soft glow. She turned when she heard me and smiled, though her eyes looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. "Ethan told me to feed you," she said lightly, pulling open a drawer for cutlery. "So sit. I don't argue with orders from my son." I laughed and took a seat at the small wooden table. The clink of plates and hum of the microwave filled the silence until she set down 2 plates of pasta and joined me. "It's nothing special," she said, "but it's better than letting it go to waste." We ate in that easy, domestic quiet, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I watched her as she spoke about small things, the garden, a book she'd been reading, her work. But between her words, there was something else. A quiet weight. When I asked how she'd been managing since her husband passed, her fork paused midair. She smiled, small and sad. "You know, people stop asking that after the first year," she said. "They assume you've adjusted. Maybe you do, in a way. But some days," she exhaled slowly. "Some days the silence in this house feels like another person." Her honesty caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to say, only that I didn't want her to feel alone in that silence. "You make it sound peaceful," I said softly. "But I guess it's not." She looked at me for a long moment, and the corners of her eyes softened. "Sometimes it is," she said. "And sometimes it's too much peace." We both laughed quietly, but the sound carried something heavier beneath it. She reached out then, almost absent-mindedly, and placed her hand over mine. Her fingers were warm, her touch gentle but grounding. For a second, we just stayed like that, caught in a small, unspoken stillness. When she realized how long her hand had lingered, she drew it back quickly and cleared her throat. "Sorry," she murmured, her cheeks faintly flushed. "Don't be," I said, barely above a whisper. The room seemed to shrink around us, the low hum of the refrigerator, the flicker of candlelight, her perfume faint in the air. Nothing about that moment was loud, but everything about it felt enormous. When she smiled again, it was soft, almost wistful. "You have a kind heart," she said. "You remind me that not all things fade." She stood then, taking our plates to the sink, and for a few moments, all I could do was watch her in the quiet glow of the kitchen, a woman who had lived, lost, and learned to stand tall again. That night, as I walked home through the still air, I realized I wasn't thinking about her beauty anymore. I was thinking about her loneliness, and how I wanted, somehow, to ease it. The rain came out of nowhere that afternoon, sudden, heavy, and full of that earthy scent that turns the world quiet. I had come by to return a book Mrs. Lawson had lent me, one she said needed to be read slowly. The sky had been cloudy when I arrived, but within minutes, it turned to downpour. She laughed as she shut the patio doors, water streaking down the glass. "You've got terrible timing," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Looks like you're trapped here for a while." I tried to play it off, smiling. "I've had worse company." Her eyes flicked to mine, amused but softer than usual. "Flattery suits you," she said, and her voice had that warmth again, the kind that made my chest feel too tight. We stood near the door, watching the rain blur the garden into shades of gray and green. The sound filled every corner of the house, rhythmic and constant. She moved to take down the half-dry clothes we'd forgotten on the patio line, and instinctively, I followed her. The rain was colder than I expected, but she didn't rush. Her blouse clung to her shoulders, damp, her laughter mixing with the storm. "You're going to get drenched," she said, voice half scolding, half laughing. "I'll survive," I said, grabbing the last shirt. By the time we made it back under the awning, we were both soaked, hair dripping, breath uneven from running. She pressed her hand to her chest, laughing again, cheeks flushed. "You really don't listen, do you?" "Not when you're the one giving orders," I replied before I could stop myself. The words hung there, weightier than I intended. Her laughter faded, replaced by silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just thick, full of something unnamed. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain fell softer now, like a curtain closing around us. Her eyes met mine, steady, searching. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, her expression a mix of warmth and warning. "Because I might start believing you mean them." There it was, the first real admission, half hidden inside her restraint. She turned away slightly, as if afraid of her own words. I reached for the towel she offered, our fingers brushing again, familiar, yet somehow more deliberate this time. "For what it's worth," I said, voice low, "I meant it." She froze, eyes on the floor, then let out a shaky breath and smiled, small, sad, beautiful. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," she said softly, not accusing, just honest. I didn't respond. I just stood there, heart racing, the smell of rain and her perfume mingling in the air, the distance between us impossibly fragile. When the storm began to fade, she said gently, "You should dry off. I'll make tea." It wasn't a rejection, it was a retreat, graceful and necessary. But as she walked away, I could feel it, that quiet truth neither of us could take back now. The days after the rain felt strangely long. The air was clear again, sunlight spilling through the leaves, but the easy rhythm we'd fallen into was gone. Mrs. Lawson still greeted me kindly, still smiled, but there was something measured in her tone now, careful pauses where laughter used to fit. When I stopped by the house one afternoon, she was in the garden pruning the roses. She didn't look up immediately. "Ethan's not home," she said softly, almost as if rehearsed. "I know," I said. "I just came to see if you needed help." She hesitated, her hands slowing. "That's kind of you," she replied, still not meeting my eyes. "But I think I'm fine today." The space between us was full of things unsaid. The memory of that afternoon, her voice, her nearness, the soft confession hidden in the sound of rain, hovered like static between us. I wanted to say something, to break through whatever invisible wall she was building, but I didn't know how without shattering the fragile respect that still held us together. "You've been quiet lately," I said finally. She smiled faintly, trimming another branch. "Sometimes quiet is good. It keeps things simple." Her words were gentle, but they hurt. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "And if simple isn't what I want?" That made her pause. She straightened slowly, brushing her hands on her gloves. When she finally looked at me, her expression was steady but sad. "You're young," she said. "You think every connection has to mean something more." I shook my head. "This isn't about age." "Isn't it?" she whispered. For a moment, her voice faltered, a small crack in her composure. "You make me forget the lines that keep life manageable," she said. "And I can't afford that." The wind stirred the garden, carrying the faint scent of soil and roses. She turned away before I could answer, her shoulders tense. "Mrs. Lawson," I started, but she stopped me with a quiet motion of her hand. "Please," she said, softer now. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Her words lingered like the aftertaste of something bittersweet. I wanted to fight it, to tell her she didn't need to keep pretending that what we had was just politeness and coincidence. But the look in her eyes, weary, protective, told me that pushing her would only make her retreat further. So I nodded, pretending to understand. "Okay," I said. "If that's what you want." "It's what I need," she corrected, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. We stood there for a long moment, the sound of the shears clicking softly between us. When I finally turned to leave, she didn't stop me, and that silence hurt more than any words could have. As I walked away, I glanced back once. She was still in the garden, standing perfectly still among the roses, the afternoon sun casting her in gold. It struck me then how beautiful and unreachable she looked, like something meant to be admired, not touched. That night, lying awake, I realized what the ache in my chest really was, not just longing, but the weight of almost. Almost seen. Almost understood. Almost loved. The silence between us lasted longer than I expected. Days passed with no messages, no visits. I tried to convince myself it was better that way, that the distance would help me forget the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her eyes, the softness of her touch. But it didn't. It only made me realize how much space she had taken up inside my thoughts. Then, one evening, when the sky outside had turned a deep violet, I heard a quiet knock on the door of the guest room where I was staying. I opened it, and there she was, standing in the dim hallway, her hair loosely tied, wearing a simple gray sweater. Her face looked calm, but her eyes were tired, like she'd been wrestling with words for days. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She sat down at the edge of the chair, hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet hum of crickets outside filled the silence. "I owe you an apology," she began finally. "I shouldn't have let things get so blurred. I should have been more careful." Her words felt rehearsed, but the tremor in her voice wasn't. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "We just felt something we shouldn't," she interrupted softly. "I know." She looked up then, her eyes glistening under the lamplight. "You have to understand," she continued, "I wasn't expecting any of this. After my husband died, I built walls, strong ones. They kept me safe, kept things simple. And then you came back, and suddenly the house didn't feel so quiet anymore." Her confession hung between us, tender and raw. I sat down across from her, leaning forward. "I never wanted to complicate your life," I said. "I just wanted to be someone you could talk to. Someone who saw you." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You already are." That's what makes this so hard. For a moment, her composure slipped. A tear slipped down her cheek, and before I could think, I reached out, brushing it away with my thumb. She didn't pull back. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning slightly into the touch. Sometimes I forget how long it's been since someone's been this kind to me, she whispered. Kindness isn't supposed to be rare, I said softly. She let out a breath that sounded halfway between a sigh and a laugh. You say things like that, and I remember why I kept my distance. I smiled sadly. Because it's easier than feeling again? She nodded. Exactly that. Then, without thinking, she reached for my hand, not in passion, but in peace. Her fingers laced with mine, her thumb tracing slow circles against my skin. I don't know what this is, she said quietly, but it's real. And I don't want to regret it, even if it can't go anywhere. I squeezed her hand, the weight of her honesty settling deep in my chest. Then let's not regret it, I whispered. For the first time, there was no tension between us, only stillness, gentle and full. Two people who had finally stopped pretending. The morning I left her house was brighter than any I remembered that summer. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, painting the room in gold. She was already there, making coffee like she always did, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair loose, movements unhurried. It felt painfully ordinary, and that's what made it harder. Morning, I said, my voice still rough from sleep. She turned, her smile soft but guarded. Morning. I made you some toast. Figured you'd need something before the drive. I nodded, taking the seat at the small wooden table. The same seat I'd sat in 100 times, only now every detail, the chipped edge, the sound of her spoon against the mug, the smell of her perfume in the air, felt heavier, permanent in memory. For a while, we just sat there, eating quietly. It wasn't awkward, it was gentle. The kind of silence that understands itself. She finally spoke, her voice low. I didn't think it would feel this strange, she said, eyes fixed on her cup. What do you mean? This house, it's been loud lately. Laughter, footsteps, someone talking to me about everything and nothing. It's been nice. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I guess I got used to it. I didn't trust myself to say much, so I just nodded. My heart felt like it was fighting to memorize the moment, the warmth of the sunlight on her skin, the tiny freckle near her collarbone, the sound of her quiet breath as she tried not to say too much. When she finally looked up, there was something unguarded in her expression. You've grown, you know. Not just older, steadier. Wiser. It's been good watching that. I had a good teacher, I said with a small smile. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Don't flatter me. I barely know what I'm doing half the time. We shared that laugh, soft, sincere, the kind that only happens when two people know they're at the end of something they'll never quite forget. When it was time to leave, she followed me to the door. The air outside was cool, the scent of jasmine hanging lightly in the garden. She stood close, her hand brushing against my arm as if testing the distance between us. Drive safe, she said. I will. Then came the pause, that familiar stillness between one heartbeat and the next. She stepped forward, her hand finding mine. You made this summer a little less lonely, she whispered. And you made it unforgettable, I replied. She looked up, eyes shining, and for a moment, it felt like everything, the words unsaid, the feelings unspoken, was understood in silence. Then, she leaned in and kissed my cheek. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just, warm. Real. Her lips lingered for a breath longer than politeness required, and when she stepped back, there was that same small, knowing smile. Go, she said softly, before I change my mind. I smiled, nodded, and walked toward the car. As I started the engine and looked in the rearview mirror, she was still standing there, one hand raised, the sunlight catching in her hair. Driving away, I didn't feel regret. Just a quiet fullness. Because some connections don't need promises or permanence. They just need to exist, for a moment, deeply and honestly. And that's what we were. A moment that mattered. If this story touched your heart, leave a red heart in the comments and tell me your favorite moment. Don't forget to subscribe for more slow burn age gap romances, stories that don't shout, but whisper their way into your heart.